next speaker, Ramsey Schaffer, if I said that correctly, is going to be talking about something that I was thinking about recently. So every time I see a stock dip because of bad press, I'm like, I should write a sentiment analyzer to just hook into the Robinhood API. And then I was like, no, I'm too dumb for that. But Ramsey isn't. So big round of applause to Ramsey.
You set that up perfectly. Thank you. I don't need that. All right, that was the perfect introduction. I couldn't have done it better myself. Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Like you said, I'm Ramsey. I'm a co-founder of a website called Babbel. Me and a few other guys outside our day jobs are putting together a website that does exactly like he said, analyzes the news to help us, predict the stock market and make good decisions. So, as you're probably guessing right now, the name of the game for this talk will be stock market sentiment. I need my clicker. And specifically, we'll be talking about the news and how to write code that finds good stock market insights automatically within the news. So before I get started, a quick show of hands. How many of you in this room have invested a little bit on your own in the markets? Robinhood, maybe E-Trade, something. Okay, nice, awesome. That's more than I was expecting. Okay, so for those of you who have and haven't, the name of the game for stock market, its success consistently seems to come down to reading. I think 90% of successful investing can be equated to reading, whether that's charts, news articles, social media posts, company filings, all of this information, you compile it together to find credible information, make educated and timely decisions, and ultimately try to make some money, right? Of course, what you're seeing here from the example is that there's a vast abundance of information, too much for a single person to read on their own. Tesla, for example, thousands of tweets every hour, millions of posts and articles every year. It would take a single human being a year to read everything published about Tesla in a single day. So it's obviously unfeasible to read it all, gauge the aggregate mood by yourself, but what if there was ways to do that with a computer? And I think if I were to summarize this slide, for most DIY investors, the problem isn't just lack of information, it's the lack of time to find enough information to make a good decision. So how do we find a signal in all of this noise? Well, the solution I will propose to you today is outsourcing that reading to a computer and using some fancy code and some clever logic to do it in a way that helps you identify what's actually worth reading and what makes an impact. But the question here becomes, how do we actually tell a computer how to read the stock market news effectively? And I would summarize this into 4 steps, which we'll be spending the rest of today's talk about. First, getting the news data. Second, cleaning that data and formatting it in a way that you can actually process it with a computer. 3, and most importantly, keyword here, identify valuable features, like we're showing on the right. How do we take that text that we've cleaned and identify names, topics, and the mood about those names and topics, and then also identify past, present, and future tense so that we can ultimately quantify the score of that article for how bullish or bearish the text is about a company. And luckily, I've spent some time working on that myself with Sam, my co-founder. We have a pipeline in place to do that, which I'll walk you through how you can do it yourself. And now for my best Billy Mays impression, we've done this, you can too. All right, so before I get into the actual code, I want to show you guys kind of a quick example of how we've done this in the past to actually make some money in the market. We'll take a look at Kroger. Kroger is a gigantic retail grocer similar to Costco or Amazon. They sell groceries, and they have a lot of stores. And Kroger's stock, specifically over the past 6 months, has done very well, at least up until September. No spoilers, but they were up 40% over the majority of the year, which is pretty impressive, trading at an all-time high, heading into their second quarter earnings report, which was on September 10th. And so Sam and I looked at ourselves and said, okay, the earnings report is generally a good buying or selling opportunity. There's a lot of volatility relating to the stock. Can we guess which direction Kroger is going to go? Is it going to keep going up, or will it fall back down to earth? And so we took a look at the sentiment for Kroger in the news. We analyzed a couple hundred articles published about Kroger over that time. Apologize that the chart's probably a little small, but the gist here is that despite the all-time high stock price, we are seeing extremely bearish or negative sentiment about Kroger in the news, which was kind of counterintuitive, right? High stock price, why would everyone be talking about Kroger with negativity? And so we did a little bit more research. We inputted into some of the algorithms we created, and we felt like we had determined that Kroger was very overhyped in the price relative to what people were saying about it. There was a good case to be made that Kroger stock should go down. And we looked a little bit more into the articles that were being published about Kroger. Why would this sentiment be so negative in the first place? And identified a few main things. First, people were upset about the amount of debt that Kroger had. Second, people were upset with managerial decisions that Kroger was making. Specifically, a lot of people on Twitter and in the news were unhappy that they had elected Elaine Chao to their board of directors. A lot of people were upset about how they were paying their employees during COVID. All of this to say that there was a reasonable case to be made that when Kroger did announce their earnings, the stock would go down. And we had identified this using sentiment and then built the case by actually looking into the articles. So from here, we felt confident that we had made an educated and well-informed decision. What do? We shorted Kroger stock. We bet that Kroger is going to go down over the next few weeks, and then basically waited to see what happened. Kroger released their earnings. Over the next 20 days, the stock fell 17%, ended up making more money than I had anticipated doing. And at the end of the day, felt pretty confident that there was something there, and that sentiment could be a useful tool for identifying when opportunities were available to make or sell stocks. And if you guys are interested in reading more about this specific case, we wrote a report back when we made the decision in early September. It's on our Substack. You can read it for free. But of course, this is just one instance of where you can use sentiment. So let's talk more now about how you can do this yourself, specifically in Python, and some of the tricks of the trade for going through the process like I walked you through earlier. So first things first, we'll talk about step one, which is getting the data. And there's a few ways you can do this. There's a lot of different platforms and I guess strategies for gathering data, one being just scraping the internet yourself. And I should say before I get too deep into this, if this is going to get relatively technical, so if any of you guys are like feeling like it's over your head, just give me one of these and I'll maybe slow down a little bit. And other options too, like APIs, which you can pay for, that will give you data for you. You can get them for articles or social media. Sam and I have chosen to use IEX Cloud, which is a relatively cheap API that gives you a lot of market data over time. And as you can see from the little code snippet on the right, it's pretty straightforward to implement. So given all this, there's options for getting the data. You pick whichever option you want, in this case IEX Cloud, and then you're able to actually get articles from the internet, put them into a place where you can analyze them using code. And for the rest of this demonstration, we'll be looking at specifically this article you see on the screen. It's an article about Nike that was published last week. And we'll walk through how you would take this article and score it for the sentiment. So looking at this article as a human being, right, we see the title, Is Nike Stock Ready to Reach an All-Time High? Right off the bat, a little bit clickbaity, kind of incentivizing you to actually read the article. I mean, just by giving it a glance, you can tell that there's some relatively bullish outlooks from the author, Melanie Schaffer, no relation to me. And so the question is, how do we take an article that we know is bullish and actually codify that into code that we can run on this article and then other articles after that? So from there, we take the raw code or the raw article that we got from IEX Cloud, and then we want to clean it such that we can identify only the important sentences in the article that actually matter. As you probably know, a lot of articles written today have advertisements worked into them at the top or bottom, other irrelevant things that aren't even about the stock. Some articles mention many stocks. In this case, we just care about the sentences about Nike, right? So what you're seeing here on your screen is we've taken the code written on the right and gone through the article to identify all of the sentences about Nike And then we've done some other special things like removing special characters and contractions to help the computer read it more effectively, separating the sentences out into individual components so that the computer can grade them individually. And then we've done some work with the nouns used in the article to help the computer know when the article is talking about Nike. So for example, in the first sentence, of course, this is a pretty easy one. On Tuesday, Nike Inc. was trading up about 1%. The computer would know that that is talking about Nike, but if we look down at the end of that paragraph, once it begins selling, that's ambiguous. It's using it instead of the word Nike. Long story short, there's code that you can write that actually identifies that it is referring back to Nike. And so the gist of this is we take the raw text, we get Nike sentences, and then we move on to actually identifying valuable features from those sentences. And so what you're seeing here on the screen is our process for actually identifying those valuable features. Specifically, where we want to get to here is one singular score for how bullish or bearish the author's outcome of Nike is. And what you're seeing is that this article is relatively bullish, as we saw at the beginning, just from our human perspective, 73% bullish according to the computer. And how we've done this, using the steps on the side in the code, is creating a vocabulary of words that we would say are optimistic or pessimistic about the stock itself. So, for example, in that first sentence, trading up about 1%, we tell the computer, this is an optimistic thing about the company. We do this a number of times until we have a large vocabulary of words that we feel confident are encapsulating what's actually happening with the stock. And then we apply that to the text to say, this sentence is optimistic, this one's pessimistic. And I should say, there are existing coding libraries out there that will do this for you. We found in our experience that they don't apply very well to finance language, so we've elected to write our own vocabulary for it. But nonetheless, once you've got an idea of the mood for each of the sentences, the next step then in determining if it's a bullish or bearish sentence is to look at the tense of that sentence, looking at if it's in the past tense, present tense, or future tense, and specifically if you want to know the author's outlook about the stock, you want to be focusing more on the sentences written in future tense than the sentences that are talking about what's happened in the past. So, long story short, the code that you're seeing on the right and some other code which we'll send out in a repository after the presentation if anyone's interested, is this code looks at all the mood of each of the sentences, identifies which ones are talking about the stock into the future, and then combines those into one singular score for how optimistic or bullish or bearish the article is about the ticker you're interested in. So great, once we've done that, we have ourselves a pipeline. And with a pipeline, we can start applying what we just did to one article to any number of articles, right? So we can take a look at this article about Nike. We can also take a look at the past 1,000 articles written about Nike. And at the end of the day, we can replicate and say, what is the outlook about Nike across platforms, across authors, and across time? So we can get a better representation of what that actual mood is about the stock so that we can ultimately make a good decision with it. And likewise, once we have a good representation of an individual stock, we can also do this for other stocks. We can do it across different platforms, like I mentioned. And we can ultimately group those stocks into different groups for markets, for industries, for meme stocks. If you're interested in seeing, for example, meme stocks were extremely pessimistic last week, maybe I should buy some of those, right? And so from there, we have ourselves a way to actually quantify and capture insight from the mood, from the news, relatively efficiently without having to read everything ourselves. And with this, there's some implications that bring with it. Sorry. The implications are that we can augment our human limitations by outsourcing some of the hard stuff that's hard for us to do as humans to the computer. So by quantifying the bullish or bearishness of an article reliably at scale, we can start doing things like identifying consensus opinions across different platforms, across authors. For example, there's a lot of articles written negatively about Tesla. There's a lot written positively about Tesla. What is the overlying opinion? What is the consensus that the majority of people think about it, rather than just these select few authors? This also allows us to identify articles that aren't even worth our time in the first place. We can find articles that tend to be clickbait or just trying to sell us ads, essentially. We can identify which articles are actually really insightful and the author actually put a lot of time and effort into. And so at the end of the day, with this sentiment analysis, we can identify what's worth our time, we can detect trends and events, and we can find that consensus to ultimately help us make better decisions in the market. Now the question is, if you don't want to do all this code yourself, what do you do? Well, Sam and I have been working on a website over the past few months that does it all for you. So what you're seeing here is an initial mock-up of our website. It's called babel.dev, not the language learning app, I promise. And this website does exactly like what we've just talked about. It takes the pipeline, it uses these rules to identify the trends, to identify consensus, and to ultimately identify which articles are worth reading. So with that, I know we kind of still have a little bit of time, but I will kind of close in saying, this is a quote that my mom kind of had on our wall growing up. I'm sure many of you had similar quotes on your walls from your parents. Life is short. There's no time to leave important words unsaid. Now bear with me. I've adapted this slightly for today's talk. Life is too short to leave important words unread. And so with that, the insight is out there. There's ways to automate it, and we can do that relatively effectively using Python so that we can identify what matters and what doesn't. We can find the insight, and we can ultimately make better decisions with our money. So with that, I leave you. Thank you, everyone. If you're interested in seeing the code that we included today, we can send repositories to anyone who emails us at team@babel.dev. If you're interested in joining the waitlist for our website, you can see it there. And if you're interested in seeing our free weekly newsletter, the one I mentioned earlier with Kroger, you can check it out at babel.substack.com. All right, thank you.